Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. I'll be honest, this was a weird week to be making fun little music theory videos. As I record this, the US election hasn't happened yet, so I have no idea what the mood will be like when it comes out, but judging by the state of things here on Sunday, I'm gonna guess that by Friday we could all use a healthy dose of weirdness and surrealism to help cope with whatever happened or may very well still be happening, so I thought I'd look at the breakout single by one of the weirdest bands from one of the weirdest eras in rock history, Psycho Killer by the Talking Heads. Let's take it apart. The song starts like this. With Tina Weymouth laying down the iconic bass riff. It's what I like to call a minimum riff. It walks right up to the edge of being boring, but it does just enough at just the right time with just the right pieces that it somehow manages to be really cool instead. Like, look at it, it's 8 beats long and 6.5 of those are just quarter note A. Everything spicy happens in this last beat and a half with just 2 notes. It's an impressive balancing act, and if you can pull it off, it's a great way to make sure your riff really sticks in your listener's head. After all, if any small change ruins the entire thing, it's hard to forget how it goes. But how do I know that any small change ruins the riff? Because I tried. Let's start with the notes. Again, it's mostly A, the root of the key, and then at the end we drop to E, the 5th, then G, the flat 7th. At a glance, these 2 notes might imply a transition to the 5 chord. 1/5 is a pretty common vamp after all, but if we look a bit closer, that starts to make a bit less sense. The point of a 1/5 vamp is that the 5 chord has this strong directional pull back to 1, but that pull only really works if the 5 chord is major, and here we have G natural, the minor 3rd. If we swap it out for G sharp, it sounds too shiny. It loses that bluesy bite, so while it's technically a stronger resolution, it also sounds super generic and classical. Fortunately, there's another explanation, but to get there, we're gonna have to talk rhythm. The riff is dominated by this marching quarter note pattern with just 1 extra 8th note tossed in to break up the monotony. And what note is Weymouth playing on that decorative 8th? It's the E. Now, if we were supposed to hear an E chord here, we'd expect the root to be on a strong rhythmic position like beat 3, or even beat 4, but instead it shifted to literally the weakest point in the entire bar. This means we can just roll it in with the A and treat G as the actual root of our new chord, giving us a 1 flat 7 vamp instead. Flat 7 to 1 is often called the backdoor resolution because it kinda sneaks you back home, and it seems to be what the bass is implying. From there we get a couple guitar chords from Jerry Harrison, and I'm pretty sure these are using what's called harmonics, which is a playing technique where instead of fully fretting the string, you just place your finger gently on it, and if you put it in the right spot, you get this really nice crisp tone, almost like a bell. This only works at certain points on the string, so compared to fretted notes, your pitch options are much more limited, but among those options are a couple different kinds of G chord, creating a nice spacey effect over the driving A in the bass part. Next, the guitar joins in with the riff. This increases the sense of urgency, switching from that driving quarter note pulse to a more insistent set of 8ths, but the really clever bit comes at the end where they switch to 16ths. Not only does this build up rhythmic tension, but they're also doing a really cool thing with the harmony. Remember, the bass part is implying that the chord here is G7, setting up a backdoor resolution to A, but instead Harrison plays A diminished 7, which contains neither the E nor the G that the bass is playing underneath it. Now, diminished 7th chords are really flexible in their resolutions, and A diminished 7 can lead back to A through what's called a common tone resolution, so the 2 parts are both trying to set up a return to the same place, but they're doing it in 2 fundamentally incompatible ways, creating a sense of harmonic chaos that ties in with the song's disturbing theme. That settles down in the verse, where Harrison switches from those sharp stabs to a smoother, more melodic arpeggio outlining A dominant 7. The use of a dominant 1 chord helps create a bit more internal conflict in the music. It's not particularly dissonant, but it has this sort of bite to it that makes it feel just a little on edge even though it's the root. On the other hand, the diminished chord is gone, and in its place he just plays a G chord like the bass implies. It's kinda like the 2 chords decided to meet in the middle. In the intro, one was very resolved while the other was absurdly dissonant, but here they're both just a little bit rough. And I can't really talk about Psycho Killer without mentioning David Byrne's vocals.
I can't seem to face up to the facts. I'm tense and nervous and I can't relax.
He's doing this sort of half-spoken delivery where his pitch isn't super precise and he doesn't really hold the notes, making it feel more like a conversation than a performance. This is a pretty common technique for Byrne, and it gives his music a sort of intentional sloppiness, like a painter who won't paint within the lines. It breaks down the barrier between artist and listener, stripping out the pretense of grand melodic gestures so he can more bluntly describe the ideas he's trying to convey. In this case, the song's trying to put you in the head of a serial killer, and that's not supposed to sound pretty. From there, there we move to the chorus, which alternates between two sections. First there's this, which is like a more extreme version of the backdoor resolution, spending a full bar on each chord and adding in the flat 6 at the start in order to get a more complete walk up to the 1. And speaking of the 1, it's a bit hard to tell with just the guitar and bass because Harrison just plays a quick stab and then lays out, but Byrne's melody features some C naturals,
Fa 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 fa.
so I think it's safe to say we're in minor. Keep that in mind as we move on to the other section, where we get the same F and G chords, but this time we end up on C major instead. The keys of C major and A minor have what's called a relative relationship, which means they have all the same notes, they just use them differently, and switching to the relative major recontextualizes everything we're hearing. Whereas in the first part, F and G were flat 6 and flat 7, setting up a backdoor resolution to the minor one, here they're 4 and 5, setting up a stronger, more classical resolution to the major one. The section is contrasting these two harmonic devices, relying on the same chords but in different contexts, leading to different results. The melody is also pushing this dichotomy. In both sections it starts on C, the 5th of the F chord, then slides down to B, the 3rd of the D chord.
Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est?
And that B sits right between our two roots, so it can slide down to A,
Qu'est-ce que c'est? Fa fa fa.
or up to C.
Run away.
So just like with the chords, we have the same melodic structure being pointed in two different directions. And yes, it's also cool that the shift to the relative major happens on the line Run Away. It makes this excursion feel like an attempt to escape the darkness of our psycho killer's mind, an attempt that sadly doesn't seem to work. At the end of the chorus, we get that same F and G again, this time setting up a return to the riff while Byrne sings this. Which, in the context of the chorus harmony, is deceptively interesting. The first part is over the last C major, and it arpeggiates the entire chord like a desperate attempt to hold on to that light, but at the top it just keeps going, sliding up to A and returning to the minor root that defines the rest of the song. It makes one last break for B, the leading tone in C, as if he's trying to do this. But instead of resolving up, he drops back down, pulled in by the gravity of that A. It's a sad story, and the sheer desperation in Byrne's voice really helps sell that slide into darkness. But before we move on, I want to talk about Chris France's drums. After the intro, he's mostly going back and forth between two patterns. Under the verses, he plays this, which is a pretty simple rock groove supporting the relatively calm feel of the section. For the chorus and bridge, though, the music starts to feel unsettled, and he switches to this. And look, I know I say this every time I find a song that does it, but more songs should put the snare on all 4 beats. It always sounds great. In this case, it plays with our sense of rhythmic urgency, driving you through the bar and making it hard to find a spot to relax. From there, the song repeats, so let's skip ahead to the bridge. Here we get a pretty sudden... I don't know, is this a key change? I'm gonna call it a key change, you can fight me in the comments. The reason I'm hesitant though is that I'm not entirely sure which key we changed to. In fact, I'm not sure we're really in a key at all. I think we're in what's called a shuttle, which is just a 2-chord vamp without a clear root. The section exists in the space created by a B minor chord and a G major chord. If you want to call one of those the one, be my guest, but I think what's happening has a lot more to do with the relationship between the two chords than with any larger tonal structure. That relationship is called a diatonic mediant, which just means they're a third apart and share as many notes as possible. Both chords have a B and a D, it's just B minor has F sharp while G major has G, a distinction that gets emphasized here by the melody which floats between those two notes.
Ce que j'ai fait ce soir-là.
They're incredibly similar chords and movement between them is extremely smooth, but because they're different qualities, they have different emotional impacts, so we sort of drift back and forth between two different mental states with the same basic musical framework, just like we did in the chorus, but with a new set of tools. A lot of the momentum of the bridge, though, comes from Weymouth's bass part. While pretty much everyone else is just playing the same thing on every beat, this part starts on F sharp, the 5th of the B chord, then walks all the way down past the root to the flat 7, creating this descending line that really draws you through the section before turning around and walking back up. In the second half, it starts on G, the root of the chord, instead, then walks down from there to D, the 5th, before jumping up and doing it again. Much like with the melody, starting these lines on F sharp and G helps to really draw your attention to the differences between the two chords. I also really like the end of the walk down where she hits A, then turns around and walks back up to C sharp. sharp. This is a tritone away from the G she's about to leap to, so it makes the chord transition feel a lot more jagged than it otherwise would be, adding some conflict to a pretty smooth chord motion. That takes us to the second part of the bridge. And I'll be honest, this confused me, like, a lot. Not the chords, they're just A and G, we already talked about that. You can view these as an extension of the previous bit, using the same G chord but replacing the B minor with an A to bring us back to our main key, but at the end of the day, it's just the progression from the riff but with more space given to the flat 7. No, what confused me was the bass. Like I said, the guitar's playing A major, but this looks like a D major arpeggio, so what the heck? My first instinct when I see two different chords in two different registers is to call it a polychord because that's the fancy music theory term for when that happens, but it didn't feel right here. Polychords are usually pretty dissonant, and when they're not, there's usually a better analysis. I could try just rolling all the notes together, adding the D and F sharp from the bass to the A, C sharp, and E in the guitar and call it D major 9, but in context it doesn't really sound like a D chord. I considered a couple other approaches, but they all felt pretty tenuous, so eventually I had to give up and just ask for help on Twitter and hope that one of my theorist friends would have a better answer, and after some conversations with Dr. Dan Ketter and Elizabeth Monzengo, I think I have an analysis I like. The first trick was to notice that this looks kind of like what's called an auxiliary 6/4. A 6/4 chord is a super classical thing where you take a normal triad like A major and replace the 3rd and 5th with notes that are a 4th and 6th above the root. If we do that here, it gives us this, which has all the same notes as D major, but by classical convention, we'd still view it as a sort of A chord, just a weirdly decorated one. In the case of the auxiliary 6/4, you'd take that chord and sandwich it in between two statements of the normal triad like this. Now, it's not a perfect comparison. In the auxiliary 6/4, the bass is supposed to stay still so you don't get any real sense of harmonic motion, but here the line is happening in the bass, so that anchoring job is done by the guitar instead. That's why the riff starts on beat 2. It gives you time to absorb the quote-unquote correct harmony before you get distracted by these notes that are really just there for decoration. The other trick was to recognize that this A chord sits in between two G chords, and underneath each of those, the bass settles on a low D, which in that context is the 5th, so using it again here kind of carries that D sound through. This technique of holding a chord tone as you move through chords it's not a part of is called a pedal, and it makes this D feel more comfortable than it otherwise would. Now, I'm not sure either explanation on its own is really sufficient, but taken as part of a larger picture, we start to get a sense of what's happening here. It's kind of a polychord, kind of a 6/4, kind of a pedal, and kind of a lot of other things too. That's the thing about music theory, not every sound is going to fit perfectly into one of the little boxes we've defined. But all these analyses do point towards a common theme, which is that the bass notes are providing a secondary musical context. Both lines work, but they're not really listening to each other. It's yet another variation on that same theme of internal conflict we've been hearing throughout the song. Still not sure what to call it, though. Anyway, that takes us back into a dressed up version of the verse and then another chorus, and finally we end up with the outro, and look, I could transcribe all the different lines here and try to break down the ways they all fit together, but I mean, listen to it. The specific notes aren't the point. It's auditory chaos to the point where I feel like individually labeling all the elements doesn't actually capture the musical experience, so I'm going to take a bit of a broader view than usual and just look at the most important parts, starting with the bass. Here we're alternating between A and G, but much faster than we've seen before, like the riff has lost its sense of composure. The frantic bass line provides the grounding for the guitar experience. If we didn't have it, there'd be no through line, nothing connecting the chaos to the rest of the song. The drums start normal, but eventually France switches to playing the snare on every beat again, and since no one else steps up to define the metric structure, it starts to get really hard to tell which one's supposed to be beat 1. They're just all the same. As for the guitar, if I had to summarize it in one word, I'd have to go with pitch bending. A lot of what makes this so disorienting is that he's hitting notes and then just sort of pushing them out of tune, imitating Byrne's loose vocal delivery. Couple that with rhythms that only sort of connect with the underlying beat. Sudden bursts of speed followed by long, slow notes with unprepared changes in register. And an ending that doesn't really end so much as it just kind of collapses when it realizes everyone else has already stopped. And yeah, this section is weird. I know some people watch these videos for songwriting tips, so if you're looking to write a section like this, my advice would be to just not think too hard. There's a lot of wiggle room to create the same effect in different ways, so try to come up with things that wouldn't make sense to do, and then do them anyway. The song's a canvas, splatter some paint on it. And that's pretty much it. Much like the song itself, I'm not sure there's any clear ending I can give you. Listening to Psycho Killer is disorienting, it's uncomfortable, but it's also captivating, like a car crash you can't look away from. It's expertly crafted confusion wrapped up in the aesthetic aesthetic of carefree rock, and over 40 years after its release, it's still got some surprises up its sleeve. And hey, thanks for watching. As always, this song was chosen by my patrons on Patreon. The poll to pick the next one goes up over there next week. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.